Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
23 Russian diplomats have been given a week to get out of Britain in the biggest expulsion since the Cold War. It comes after their country refused to explain how a Soviet nerve agent came to be used against a former double agent on British soil. To take you through the main sanctions Russia will now face, the 23 Russian diplomats being expelled from the UK have been identified as undeclared intelligence officers and have been given a week to leave. The government is also freezing Russian assets where there's evidence they may be used to threaten the lives of people or property living in Britain. Theresa May also announced increased checks on private flights, customs and freight. All high-level planned bilateral talks with Russia have now been suspended, and an invitation to Russia's Foreign Ministry, Sergei Lavrov, has been revoked. And no government ministers or members of the royal family will attend this year's World Cup, which kicks off in Russia in 3 months' time. Speaking in the Commons, Theresa May said Russia had shown complete disdain for the seriousness of the attack on Sergei Skripal and his daughter, Yulia.
They have provided no credible explanation that could suggest they lost control of their nerve agent. No explanation as to how this agent came to be used in the United Kingdom. No explanation as to why Russia has an undeclared chemical weapons programme in contravention of international law. Instead, they have treated the use of a military-grade nerve agent in Europe with sarcasm, contempt and defiance. So, Mr. Speaker, there is no alternative conclusion other than that the Russian state was culpable for the attempted murder of Mr. Skripal and his daughter, and for threatening the lives of other British citizens in Salisbury, including Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey. This represents an unlawful use of force by the Russian state against the United Kingdom. The House will recall that following the murder of Mr. Litvinenko, the UK expelled 4 diplomats. Under the Vienna Convention, the United Kingdom will now expel 23 Russian diplomats who have been identified as undeclared intelligence officers. They have just 1 week to leave. This will be the single biggest expulsion for over 30 years, and it reflects the fact that this is not the first time that the Russian state has acted against our country.
A little earlier, Jason Farrell spoke to the Russian ambassador to the United Kingdom, who warned of Russian retaliation for any measures the UK takes.
We consider this measures made by the British government, as I said, absolutely unacceptable, and I'll tell you why. Because we believe that Britain should follow the international law under their obligations on the organization of the prohibition of the chemical weapons. If they have any suspicions on nerve gas or something like that, they have to make an application to the organization and make a request. And so far, we didn't get any samples.
What have you actually been told are the sanctions that are going to happen now?
The Prime Minister will tell. There will be expulsions. And of course, as you understand in the diplomatic practice, there will be answers from the Russian side.
So you expect expulsions from Moscow of British diplomats?
Well, this is always in diplomacy, there was always a reciprocity.
Do you think that Russia has pointed the finger of suspicion at itself in many ways, with the president saying, well, traitors will kick the bucket? That suggests, doesn't it, that he's inciting, at the very least, some sort of aggression towards the kind of people like Mr. Skripal?
That was absolutely different context. As far as this case, you know, the only thing that he said, that we have to get the proofs.
Do you not feel, though, that the Russian president, in his language, has, in effect, made suspicion pointed at Russia?
No.
By saying things like that?
No.
Let's bring you the very latest on this, should we? In a moment, we're going to be speaking to Lisa Holland, who's standing by in Moscow for us. And also our crime correspondent Martin Brunt is in Salisbury. But first, to our diplomatic editor Dominic Waghorn, who is in Westminster. Hello to you, Dominic. We're waiting for any Russian response to what we heard from the Prime Minister at lunchtime today.
Yeah, it's that diplomatic reciprocity that the Russian ambassador was talking about there after a meeting in the Foreign Office today. That classic tit-for-tat principle that if you expel diplomats from one country, you will expect your own diplomats to be expelled as well. And I think we're going to see that in the next day or two. That was pretty clear from what the ambassador was saying. But we understand the British ambassador has been called back into the Russian Foreign Ministry for a chat, and that may be brought up there. In terms of what else is happening diplomatically, we're going to see a UN Security Council meeting in New York that's been called by Britain. Expect diplomatic fireworks there as Britain will level its accusations again, backed by its allies. And what's crucial for Theresa May is how explicitly Britain's allies link Russia to this now, and how much Britain's allies are going to line up behind Theresa May. That's not important just to make these sanctions work, and they will be much more effective if they are backed up by the allies. But also the way this is being seen by the British government is this was an attempt, almost certainly, by the Russians to test not just Britain, but also the entire Western alliance, possibly picking on potentially the weakest link in that alliance currently because of Brexit, because of Theresa May's political weakness. And Vladimir Putin seeing how that reacts. So the argument that will be being made is that it's crucial not just for Britain but also for Europe and America to line up behind Britain. A lot of doubt about how the Trump administration will do facing up to that challenge. But the hope is from the British government that Europeans will line up behind Britain. They'll be encouraged by what NATO has said, condemning Russia and also calling for Russia to come up with answers, but they will be really looking for coordinated, united action, some kind of communique threatening Russia with action in the days ahead.
We'll wait and see, won't we, that at 8 o'clock this evening. Let's bring in London time. Let's bring in Lisa Holland, who is in Moscow. For as Moscow is saying they'll retaliate soon to Britain's expulsion of diplomats. Lisa.
Yes, Kay, within the last few minutes, we're getting more information from the Foreign Ministry here. They haven't specifically outlined yet what they're going to do, as you say. In their words, our return measures will come soon. But what they have given so far is a sort of overall response to what Theresa May has said. Moscow evaluates the statements of Theresa May as unprecedentedly rude. I mean, they used a lot of strong adjectives here: rude, provocative, unacceptable, undignified. The bottom line is that they are adamant that Britain is escalating the situation without proof, is what the Russians say. And we can, of course, expect a response from them, whether it goes above and beyond or whether matches what actions Theresa May has taken. We'll simply have to wait and see. But what we do know is that the British ambassador to Moscow, Laurie Bristow, who went into the Foreign Ministry yesterday, has been called back in again today. We're not entirely clear whether he's left yet. There's been certainly no official statements from the British Embassy here, but we would expect to hear from the Foreign Ministry, if not today, then tomorrow. And we know there's a rather high-profile press conference scheduled for tomorrow morning with the Foreign Ministry spokeswoman, and she has been fairly vociferous. She was the woman that went on the television last night sounding alarm bells when she was saying that essentially British journalists would either be thrown out or shut down if any action was taken against the Russian state media outlet RT in London. So we will wait and see what they have to say, but there is certainly absolutely zero suggestion that the Russians are going to take this lying down.
OK, for now, thank you. Let's go straight to Salisbury. Police investigation continuing there. Our crime correspondent with the very latest for us, Martin Brunt, of course. Hello to you, Martin. A second car now of interest to the police.
Well, there are a number of things going on. Certainly no let-up in police activity. I'm at the car recovery centre, a mile or so from the city centre, and we think that this is where they're holding Mr. Skripal's car that he and his daughter used to travel into the city centre on that Sunday afternoon before they were struck down. We think the car's been here for a few days. There's been something like 4 bouts of activity here over the last few days. Last night, a lot of action. This morning, some more. And now we've got police, fire crews and ambulance crews here. The only thing we're missing is the army, and they may be on their way. We think that they're preparing again, perhaps to lift the vehicle and take it off to Porton Down. The vehicle, this maroon-coloured BMW, becoming more and more a key focus of the investigation. We think that the car arrived here some days ago after being picked up from the city centre. So that's going on now. In the last few minutes, we've seen a couple of fire crews with oxygen tanks on their back. It looks as though they're preparing to put on those rather extraordinary hazmat suits. But, you know, let's give it some time and see how this develops. But there's an awful lot of activity here. And 26 miles away in Dorset, in a town called Gillingham, we've seen over the last few hours similar scenes, police, fire crews and ambulance, and the recovery of a vehicle there, which we think has been taken from the home of the driver who works here, who picked up Mr. Skripal's car. None of this confirmed by the police, but that gives you a reasonable idea of what we think is going on.
OK. For now, thank you. Thank you all. Let's take you back to our top story. Theresa May has told MPs there is a consensus on how the UK should deal with Russia. Just doesn't extend to the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, but has the government taken the right approach? Joined from Westminster by the Guardian columnist and author Owen Jones and the executive director of the Henry Jackson Society, Alan Mendoza. Hello to you both. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. Owen, to you first of all. Mr Corbyn sticking by his guns in the House of Commons this afternoon and being roundly condemned, not least by many on his own side.
Well, there's nothing like the political and media elite when there's groupthink and the very few voices who stand up, as they did during the Iraq War, Libya, Helmand Province, on and on and on, to get ridicule and then often to be vindicated. What I would say is this: it's welcome that the Conservatives have capitulated to Labour on the so-called Magnitsky Act, that is to crack down on dirty money from Russia. The fact that this city is a playground, basically, for Russian oligarchs is a disgrace. It is notable that the Conservative Party is awash with hundreds of thousands of pounds of Russian-linked money. And what we need to see, though, now is the actual details of that Magnitsky Act. Let's bear in mind that in the past, for example, on the poisoning of Litvinenko many years ago, Theresa May dragged her heels on that inquiry for so-called diplomatic reasons. When sanctions were to be imposed against Russia in the aftermath of the Ukraine crisis, and a leaked document showed the Conservatives trying to dilute sanctions against Russia on the basis that it would hurt the interests of the City of London, which is awash, as I've said, with Russian-linked dirty money. So actually, Labour took a strong line on the Magnitsky Act. The Conservatives resisted their position. And now the issue is, do we have in law drafted an amendment which will crack down on that dirty money? Because that's what's going to get them where it hurts. It's welcome those diplomats have been expelled. What will happen there is tit for tat. British diplomats will be expelled, all very reminiscent of the Cold War. But what we'll really get at what is a dirty, thuggish, criminal gangster regime in Russia, which is full of oligarchs, which, as Jeremy Corbyn said himself today, have plundered their own country and got billions of pounds in the process. The way to get them where it hurts is to get that act in practice, but that will hurt the financial interests of the sector, the City of London, that fund the Conservative Party. So we've got to hold their feet to the fire, the Conservative government, because the question is, will they act decisively? And we want sequestrations, if necessary, the confiscation of property, and also the expulsion of any oligarch which is linked to the Russian regime. OK. Alan Mendoza, getting rid of these Russian oligarchs, etc., and also land-grabbing funds from these oligarchs if they shouldn't be here, using London as a playground. Will that do it?
Well, that will certainly be a start, but let's just start from where Owen started, which was Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn was condemned not because he was brave, but because he was wrong. He wanted to dither, he wanted to dally, and members of his own party quite rightly pointed out that when there's been a breach of national security, when British citizens have been attacked on British soil, you cannot dither, you cannot dally once you've explored the evidence. You need to respond, and that is why he was condemned. Nothing to do with being brave. It was a foolish move on his part, and he's been exposed by his own party for doing so. way. But to go back to Owen's point on the Magnitsky Act, it is very important that we have this amendment. It's been pushed for a long time. It's quite right that MPs like Chris Bryant have put this forward, suggested this should be in legislation, but this has been a long sort of history to it. As you remember, Sergei Magnitsky was murdered back in 2008. There's been a global push for this sort of thing in order to stop corrupt Russian officials and others, by the way, who have been guilty of human rights abuses from taking advantage of safe havens like London has been in the past to store money and to act with impunity. It's an important step, but it won't be just the only step. I think the government need to look at the unexplained wealth orders, to actually impose some of these, to look at assets already in Britain from people who clearly could not have amassed them through legitimate means. Lots of Russians have bought things in London which cannot be explained by their salaries alone. It's time we held them to account, as well as increasing the pressure on the diplomatic front and at the United Nations to call Russia to account for its behaviour, not just in this instance, but in other instances which it's done over the past few years.
Our politicians need to offer a united front as far as that's concerned. I've seen this letter, I'm sure you've seen it as well, hastily drawn up from the front benches and others within the Labour Party, backing the Pre-Em's view that Russia definitely culpable and taking a very different line to Jeremy Corbyn. Also hearing that Jeremy Corbyn was actually briefed this morning by the security services on what they knew about what was going on in Salisbury. He does seem to be pretty isolated just at the moment.
Well, firstly, Alan Mendoza makes the point there about dithering. It's the Conservative Party that dithered. That's the whole point. The so-called Magnitsky Act to tackle Russian dirty money was itself proposed by the Labour Party. The Conservative Party, for so-called technical reasons, refused to accept it. It's only now they're talking about it. The history of the Conservative Party has been, for example, to dilute sanctions against Russia on the basis it would damage the City of London, which bankrolls the Conservative Party. As for having a so-called united front, I remember all too well the Iraq War, which the Henry Jackson Society and its key figures were principal cheerleaders on. I remember Libya, when we were told that anybody who opposed the Libyan war was a disgrace, was a stooge for Colonel Gaddafi. And Helmand Province, that anybody who opposed or criticised the government's stance on the basis that we should be united as a country against, and anybody else was a stooge of Saddam Hussein, of Colonel Gaddafi, of the Taliban. And what happened with the attempt to bully people into silence was those people who still now walk the stage of politics and who are splashed across the media as statesmen, as sensible, hard-nosed individuals who understand reality, while all the people, like Jeremy Corbyn, every single time who was vindicated is portrayed as a traitor and a coward. It was Jeremy Corbyn who was standing isolated then back in the 1980s when Britain backed Saddam Hussein as he gassed the Kurds. It was him who was one of those arrested opposing apartheid South Africa, whilst the Conservatives said they were a terrorist organisation. It was him, yes, who opposed the Iraq War, with the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people and the deaths of 189 or so British service personnel. And yes, one of about 6 MPs who opposed the war in Libya, which turned that place into a safe haven for Islamist extremists, fanatics and ISIS, and we saw the rise of ISIS across Iraq, of course, as well. The same people, over and over again, who are the architects of the biggest foreign policy catastrophes of all time, are still treated as sensible, moderate, hard-nosed people like the Henry Jackson Society, and in any decent world or society with any justice, these people would have absolutely no credibility on any subject whatsoever, and yet they still walk the stage as though we should treat them seriously, when Jeremy Corbyn was far more right than they were on the biggest foreign policy calls of our time, and I think they should be a little bit more humble about it.
OK, Alan, so there. And also I'm hearing that Aaron Banks, who, of course, bankroll UKIP, is also supporting Jeremy Corbyn's stance, so he's not just whistling in the wind on his own.
No, that's a perfect bedmate for him on this sort of issue. Owen's just listed a whole raft of things that he thinks Jeremy Corbyn was right on. Jeremy Corbyn's been wrong on many, many issues. The IRA, Hamas, Hezbollah, and indeed some of the issues he's mentioned there. The proximate reason for the Iraq War, Libya, various issues. We don't have time to get into this. This is about Russia today. But if he's suggesting that Jeremy Corbyn is right on Russia, then he is suggesting, as Seamus Mill, Jeremy Corbyn's spokesman today, said, that in actual fact, Russia was framed for this. That is indeed what Owen Owen Jones is suggesting by going down that path today. Russia was not framed for this. Russia's responsible. We've had the intelligence. Even many Labour Party MPs have supported, understood that, and Jeremy Corbyn is completely wrong on that. And the fact that Aaron Banks is his bedmate would merely suggest why and how far wrong he is on this. And that is the reason we have to look right now for resolute, firm action, Britain leading on this, and then bringing in our allies to follow that up with other measures going forward from there.
OK, so is that what you're saying, Owen, that Russia was framed?
No, I'm not saying that. What Jeremy Corbyn did today was literally directly quote what Theresa May, the Prime Minister, herself said on Monday, that either Russia was responsible or that because of their own, I can't remember, their irresponsibility, they've let weapons fall into the hands of others. He directly quoted Theresa May's own words, which suggested herself, the Prime Minister, that somebody else could be responsible and was heckled as a result. Look, I remember, Ken, you'll remember this as well. I remember during the general election, after a despicable terrorist walked into a nightclub and detonated himself and killed huge numbers of little girls, of teenage girls. And then he spoke out, yes, he was isolated, and said, we have to look, yes, at the war on terror and its role, for example, and also cuts to the security services and to the police. And do you know what I was told by pundits, by MPs, Labour MPs, some of them, who texted me full of anger, this is the end of the Labour Party. And do you know what happened? Public opinion and what the media and the political elite think are often very, very different indeed. And sometimes you do need to have courage to speak out against what is often, and I know this all too well, a suffocating groupthink in both the media, of which I'm a member, often a dissenting member, and of course the political elite. If Theresa May herself says this, and the one which it could be the Russian regime or another actor, then we should listen to that. But I would say what we could agree on is that the Russian regime is a gangster regime of thugs. There are lots of competing factions. I know one Russian dissident today said that Vladimir Putin, a disgusting homophobic authoritarian leader, by the way, that he may not have ordered it himself, that it could have been another wing of what is basically a coalition of thugs, oligarchs and gangsters. So the fact is we have to know who is individually responsible, every single individual who is responsible for these heinous acts on British soil, and they need to be taken. They need to be incarcerated. They need to languish in prison for what they did. But we need to know who was responsible, because time after time again, Libya, Iraq, Helmand province, we were told that you've got to listen to what the government says. Anybody who dissents is a traitor or a coward or a stooge. And that led to catastrophe. Enough is enough. We've got to have a debate. The leader of the opposition is doing his job by opposing and critiquing government measures, and indeed he went further than them by calling for legislation to deal with that. And I would also just quickly add, he expressed his solidarity with Russia's democratic opposition, who are extremely courageous individuals. Theresa May didn't say a single word in solidarity with the dissidents who were persecuted by that regime, and that's something we should also do as well, all of us.
We started with Owen, so final word to you, Alan.
Well, I think obviously we have a long way to go here in dealing with Russia. Russia has, for several years now, been acting with impunity when it comes to actions like state-sponsored assassinations, invasions of neighbouring countries, raining death on Syrian civilians, similar things around the world, going across in Ukraine where it still is today. And we've done very little. We did very little at the time of the Litvinenko assassination in London, which Russia was also responsible for. It's time that we got serious with Russia. It's not just time that we got serious, but it's time that our fellow allies, who've also suffered from election interference, from fake news emanating from Russia, should also come out on that. Owen is right. This is a government of corrupt kleptocrats, but he's wrong to suggest that it isn't all tied down to Vladimir Putin. This system exists because of one godfather who dominates the system. It may well be that one of his lieutenants gave the order to do this, but it's all part of the same corrupt state mechanism, and that is why a strong response to the Russian state is what is required, and that once again is what Jeremy Corbyn has missed in this whole debate. He has missed the fact that whether it was Putin or one of his lieutenants, it's the same system, and as a result we have to strike back against our system and show we will not tolerate this kind of behaviour on British soil, and nor should our allies on their soil either.
Fascinating to speak to both of you as always. Thank you, gentlemen.
Britain is expelling 23 Russian diplomats after Moscow refused to explain how a military-grade nerve agent was used on a former spy in Salisbury. It's the biggest such expulsion for more than 30 years. The Prime Minister told Parliament that the undeclared intelligence officers have just 1 week to leave. The UK has also cut off all high-level contacts with Russia and announced that government ministers and the royal family will not attend the World Cup. Here's our political editor, Laura Kunsberg.
It was right to offer Russia the opportunity to provide an explanation. But their response has demonstrated complete disdain for the gravity of these events.
The midnight deadline came and went, leaving a morning with no new answers. Theresa May went prepared to Prime Minister's questions, ready to announce the biggest diplomatic action against Russia since the Cold War.
They have treated the use of a military-grade nerve agent in Europe with sarcasm, contempt and defiance. So, Mr. Speaker, there is no alternative conclusion other than that the Russian state was culpable for the attempted murder of Mr. Skripal and his daughter. This represents an unlawful use of force by the Russian state against the United Kingdom.
So the UK will retaliate.
The United Kingdom will now expel 23 Russian diplomats who have been identified as undeclared intelligence officers. They have just 1 week to leave. This was not just an act of attempted murder in Salisbury, nor just an act against the UK. It is an affront to the prohibition on the use of chemical weapons. And it is an affront to the rules-based system on which we and our international partners depend.
So 23 diplomats suspected of being spies have 7 days to leave. All high-level contact between the UK and Russia is also being suspended, and no minister or member of the royal family will go to the World Cup. And some Russian state assets could be frozen, with possible new laws to crack down on hostile states. In a tense House of Commons, Jeremy Corbyn was not quite ready to accept the culpability of the Russian state.
Our response must be both decisive and proportionate, and based on clear evidence.
But listen to rising anger as Jeremy Corbyn turned some of his fire on the Tories.
It is, as we on these benches have expressed before, a matter of huge regret that our country's diplomatic capacity has been stripped back with cuts of 25% in the last 5 years.
It is tradition for the two main parties to stick together on foreign policy. Not these two.
This is not a question of our diplomacy, of what diplomatic support we have around the world. This is a question of the culpability of the Russian state for an act on our soil.
Fever rose.
Their continued disregard for the rule of law and for human rights must be met with unequivocal condemnation.
Look, Tories cheering Labour backbenchers. Jeremy Corbyn's team, arms folded.
The Russian government has behaved with arrogance, with inhumanity and with contempt.
But does this bother the Russian strongman, Vladimir Putin, approaching an election, campaigning in Crimea? Utterly unapologetic. An official spokeswoman claiming on Russian TV Britain doesn't understand diplomacy or the law and is full of liars, fully fledged liars. This is not just a straightforward foreign policy clash, but a fight with a country that ignores the norms. Number 10 knows this may only be the start. And there are no easy options here for the government, nothing politically tempting for them to do next. And there was real rancour on display in the House of Commons this afternoon, real anger and concern too. Now, the government has taken what they believe is decisive action into events that only really happened a few days ago. But they are also well aware there could be further retaliation from the Russian side. And they also know only too well to take bigger or bolder action, well, Britain would need the support and backing of other international friends around the world to do so. There is a meeting scheduled at the United Nations tonight that might give a first taste of whether or not there could be support for more significant action for Britain and its partners around the world to take against Russia. But this is a real moment of decision for Theresa May, her first very significant foreign policy test as Prime Minister.
Laura Kunsberg, thank you. The Prime Minister has also announced a series of sanctions against Russia and Russian state assets. Our diplomatic correspondent James Robbins has been assessing the scale of today's announcements.
Here at the Russian embassy in West London, to get an idea of the scale of this expulsion, you really have to crunch some numbers. 23 diplomats are being kicked out. That might seem not so many, but actually there are only 58 accredited Russian diplomats in the UK. So that's 40% of them being sent home. Compare that with what would seem a much bigger expulsion at the height of the Cold War, and you can see that proportionally this one's much bigger. Then in 1971, around 100 diplomats were kicked out, a huge number, but compared to the 550 Soviet diplomats then in London, it was actually smaller in proportion to today's action. It's also interesting that Theresa May made absolutely clear that in her view, the 23 diplomats being kicked out, being sent home, are all of them spies. In the City of London, it's harder to see what the impact of Theresa May's announcements will be. True, the Prime Minister announced a freeze on Russian state assets where it's believed they threaten British life or property. The anti-corruption organisation Transparency International estimates that a fifth of all the properties bought in Britain with criminal money are owned by Russians. So expect to see more use of existing legal measures to try to bring that down. But it really is the expulsions on an unprecedented scale from the Russian embassy, which are the big story today. The Prime Minister was very clear. She said, "We will fundamentally degrade Russian intelligence capability in the UK for years to come." Whatever the effect turns out to be of today's action, the Prime Minister was bold in her claims. She said that if the Russians seek to rebuild their intelligence capability, we will prevent them from doing so. James Robbins, BBC News, at the Russian embassy in West London.
Well, Britons travelling to Russia are being warned that they could now face anti-British sentiment or harassment. The Foreign Office says Britain should remain vigilant and avoid commenting publicly on political developments. Our Moscow correspondent Steve Rosenberg joins us now from Moscow. And what has been the reaction to all this in Russia?
Anger, and Moscow has been dismissive of what Theresa May said in the House of Commons. I've just come from an interview with the official spokesperson of the Russian Foreign Ministry. This is what she told me about Theresa May's statement. She said it was a political show, bad theatre, nonsense. She said it was a shocking piece of international provocation. And of Theresa May, the spokesperson of the Foreign Ministry said that the British Prime Minister was destroying international law. She even went as far as to say that this was the end of Theresa May's career because she was involved in a dirty story. Moscow will definitely respond shortly, she said, probably not today. And as you mentioned, the Foreign Office has updated its travel advice, its advice to people travelling to Russia, saying that because of heightened political tensions, people should be very careful and be aware of the possibility of anti-British sentiment and harassment.
Steve Rosenberg in Moscow, thank you.
The measures announced by Theresa May in the Commons today represent Britain's strongest action against Russia since the height of the Cold War. 23 Russian diplomats identified as undeclared spies have been given a week to leave the country. All high-level contacts with Russia have been suspended, including the cancellation of any government or royal presence at the World Cup. The Prime Minister described the Salisbury nerve agent attack as an unlawful use of force by the Russian state against the United Kingdom. Russia's response was equally forthright, a hostile act, it said. Our political correspondent Libby Wiener reports.
The Russian embassy in London, where more than a third of the diplomats were today ordered to pack their bags and leave within a week. With the former double agent Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia fighting for their lives in hospital, the Prime Minister had promised to get tough on Russia. Today she headed to the Commons to show she meant what she'd said.
The United Kingdom will now expel 23 Russian diplomats who have been identified as undeclared intelligence officers. They have just 1 week to leave. This will be the single biggest expulsion for over 30 years.
And there was no doubt whom she held responsible.
It is tragic that President Putin has chosen to act in this way. But we will not tolerate the threat to life of British people and others on British soil from the Russian government, nor will we tolerate such a flagrant breach of Russia's international obligations.
Besides the expulsion of 23 Russian diplomats, new powers are being looked at to enable the authorities to detain people trying to get into Britain who are suspected of hostile state activity. There'll be more checks on private flights and a freeze on Russian state assets, which might be used to cause harm in the UK. And no British ministers or members of the royal family will attend the World Cup in Russia. In response to the clear discomfort of some of his own MPs, Jeremy Corbyn refused to point the finger at Russia. Instead, he suggested they be given a sample of the nerve agent used in the Salisbury attack and went on to ask about Foreign Office cuts.
It is, as we on these benches have expressed before, a matter of huge regret that our country's diplomatic capacity has been stripped back with cuts of 25% in the last 5 years.
The Foreign Office itself was busy today putting out messages on social media attacking what it called Russian state aggression. That in response to Russia's Twitter denials about the poisoning of Sergei Skripal. Independent observers say relations have reached a new low, some aspects actually worse than during the Cold War.
Spies who were swapped as part of a formal process during the Cold War were then left in peace to enjoy their retirement. So it's a breach of that norm, which was actually quite important.
The Prime Minister returned to Downing Street, knowing that Russia may well respond in kind. Already tonight, the embassy has dismissed the measures she announced as a hostile act.
So, Libby, how big a deal then are these sanctions?
Well, a pretty big deal. Something like 40% of the diplomatic staff at the embassy in London are being sent back to Moscow. I think that is a pretty substantial reaction on the part of Britain to this incident in Salisbury. I think that the government does have other measures up its sleeve, and the security minister was talking a short time ago about Britain's cyber capability. So you get a sense that this is perhaps just the start of the retaliation. It all depends on what Russia does now. But, you know, it wasn't just Mr. Putin's behaviour that was the talk of Westminster today, but also Jeremy Corbyn's. He pointedly refused to condemn Russia, and his spokesman later went on to suggest that perhaps another former Soviet state, Ukraine, might have been responsible for the attack in Salisbury. Well, that was too much for some of Mr. Corbyn's backbenchers. They've now signed an early day motion suggesting that they back the Prime Minister rather than their own leader.
Libby Wiener at Westminster, thank you. Well, the big question now is, how will Russia respond? President Putin's spokesman called Theresa May's accusations absolutely unfounded. The president himself appeared briefly at a rally in Crimea today. From Moscow, our political correspondent Carl Dinnan reports.
Campaigning in Crimea today, Vladimir Putin didn't respond directly to the diplomatic expulsions from London, referring only to unspecified problems.
When we are united, we are a force that can overcome the most difficult problems.
The foreign ministry here has been more direct, calling the expulsions a totally unacceptable and hostile act, saying their response will not be long in coming.
The response will follow, we've said that. I don't think we should describe it as a symmetrical or tit-for-tat response. It will be a comprehensive response, and it will correspond to what we have heard today from the British Prime Minister.
Earlier, the Russian foreign minister said Britain wasn't even following international procedures.
We haven't received any official request from London in terms of the case of Sergei Skripal and his daughter's poisoning. We told the UK that we are ready to respond to an inquiry if it's made under the Chemical Weapons Convention.
And the British ambassador attended meetings in the foreign ministry for a second day.
I've just been in to the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs to discuss with colleagues the recent incident in Salisbury and Russia's response to the requests that we made earlier this week.
Behind the scenes, British diplomats now on tenterhooks. The Kremlin has pledged to respond to British measures against Russia in kind. So here at the British residence in Moscow, they've had to brace themselves for the possible expulsion of British diplomats. Dramatic as diplomatic expulsions look, the Kremlin may be more concerned if the UK can assemble a broad package of international economic sanctions.
So, Carla, how quickly then might the Russians retaliate to this?
Well, they've said their response will not be long in coming, so I think we're looking at days rather than weeks. We're certainly looking at diplomatic expulsions. They want to do something very similar to what Britain has done to them, but I don't think we're talking at ambassador level expulsions yet. And just like the British, the Russians will be wanting to hold something back for when this dispute escalates, as it may well do. We're only at the very beginning of this confrontation, but tonight British diplomats here are preparing to be sent home.
Carl Dinnan in Moscow, thank you. Well, aside from all the international business of politics, the people of Salisbury are still sharing their streets with troops in full chemical protective gear. Investigations widened today to include a village in Dorset, and Rupert Evelyn reports now on the ordinary people whose lives have been caught up in this crisis.
These images have become strikingly familiar. Gillingham today, and a van connected to the recovery of Sergei Skripal's car turns a housing estate into a potential site of contamination. These are anxious times for those with chemical weapons on their doorstep.
As soon as I heard what it was, I was like, why has it taken the police this long to get to where they are now?
Much like the public, clinical staff have natural concerns about their proximity to the victims, Sergei and Yulia Skripal, whose lives still hang in the balance.
The Skripal's condition hasn't changed since they were admitted here to Salisbury District Hospital. They remain in intensive care, critically ill.
Because little is known about Novichok, treatment, say experts, will be challenging.
You're throwing everything, if you like, at the patient to keep them alive. You have to keep administering antidotes. The one that counteracts the effect of the nerve agent, you keep administering until there are no obvious signs of nerve agent poisoning. That is, somebody doesn't have the characteristic symptoms of nerve agent poisoning.
Whether forensically close to the investigation or just manning a cordon, the demands on the police bring their own pressures that include managing their welfare.
Every day is something different. I feel very passionately and I'm concerned about my colleagues that are affected by this, but I'm immensely proud of them at the same time.
For now, this is normal for Wiltshire. These are indeed extraordinary times. Rupert Evelyn, ITV News, Salisbury.
23 Russian diplomats will be expelled from Britain in response to the nerve agent attack in Salisbury. Theresa May told MPs that there was no alternative to the conclusion that the Russian state was responsible for the attempted murder of Sergei Skripal and his daughter. Well, shortly, I'll speak with our international editor, Lindsay Hilsum, in Moscow. But first, our political editor, Gary Gibbon, reports from Westminster.
Police today have been removing vehicles from a street in Gillingham in Dorset in connection with last week's chemical attack in Salisbury. The investigation continues, but Theresa May said it was time for a full and robust response. The Prime Minister said Russia had been given until midnight last night to explain how a Russian-made nerve agent was deployed against a former agent living in Britain.
They have treated the use of a military-grade nerve agent in Europe with sarcasm, contempt and defiance. The United Kingdom will now expel 23 Russian diplomats who have been identified as undeclared intelligence officers. They have just 1 week to leave.
This is the biggest expulsion of diplomats since the end of the Cold War. Theresa May said she hoped to seriously degrade Russia's spying capability in this country. The government is hoping that this is at the higher end of President Putin's expectations and might just make him pause for thought. But they're also braced for an even bigger retaliation from him, which in turn Britain could respond to by expelling even more diplomats from here. Many could be thrown out from this Russian embassy compound in North London. The Labour leader sounded sceptical about whether the evidence was there to support that action, as he asked Theresa May a series of questions.
How has she responded to the Russian government's request for a sample of the agent used in the Salisbury attack to run its own tests? It is, as we on these benches have expressed before, a matter of huge regret that our country's diplomatic capacity has been stripped back with cuts of 25%. in the last 5 years.
Tories cried shame. Mr Corbyn's spokesman said after the Iraq war, the leader wasn't going to accept the government's word on weapons of mass destruction. Some Labour MPs said Mr Corbyn didn't speak for them.
Responding with strength and resolve when your country is under threat is an essential component of political leadership. There is a Labour tradition that understands that, and it has been understood by Prime Ministers of all parties who have stood at that dispatch box.
So their continued disregard for the rule of law and for human rights must be met with unequivocal condemnation.
Tories cheered, relishing the divisions on Labour's benches. There were rumours that Jeremy Corbyn's response to the attack in Salisbury could trigger resignations from his own front bench on the back of the government action, now awaiting the inevitable Russian retaliation.
Well, after the Prime Minister spoke this afternoon, the response from the Russian government was swift. Their ambassador to the UK described the action as hostile. Our international editor, Lindsay Hilsum, is in Moscow and joins me now. Lindsay, what's the reaction there tonight?
Well, the Foreign Ministry spokeswoman, she spoke first, and what she said was this was all political. She even complained that they hadn't had access to their citizen, Yulia Skripal. They should have had consular access. But the main point she was making was there was no proof, and this should all go through the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. The same point, it should be pointed out, that Jeremy Corbyn made. And even the French, interestingly, have said that they want to see more proof too. What the Russians seem to imply is that this is some kind of vendetta which the British have against Russia. And what characterises their reaction is fury and denial.
Президент Российской Федерации Владимир Владимирович Путин.
The crowd was adoring.
Добрый день, дорогие друзья.
The Russian president triumphant.
Крепко обнимаю.
Diplomats expelled. State assets potentially frozen in London. He wasn't talking about that, but about Sunday's election, where he will undoubtedly be returned to power. The first reaction from the Russian Foreign Ministry was anger.
They've not given any samples to anyone. No one's even allowed to go near the investigation.
Earlier, the Russian foreign minister, busy selling weapons to NATO member Turkey, was dismissive.
When we receive an official request, we will surely provide an answer within 10 days, in accordance with our responsibilities towards the Chemical Weapons Convention. Meanwhile, instead of sending such a request, the United Kingdom continues to play political performance.
The British ambassador, also at the Foreign Ministry earlier, knows that by tomorrow 23 of his staff are likely to be expelled. The Soviets cleaned up some of their chemical weapons facilities in the mid-1990s, but they never admitted to developing Novichok, the nerve agent used against Mr. Skripal and his daughter. So they're highly unlikely to admit it now. So later tonight, there'll be a meeting of the UN Security Council called by the British. NATO are going to meet tomorrow. But here in Moscow, what we can expect is more denial, retaliatory measures, tit for tat, and I think also a lot of trying to get many other countries on their side, demanding proof, saying that there's a process for this, and that the British have acted impulsively, made their own decisions to go ahead against the Russians without producing the proof that the Russians are going to say the rest of the world demands.
Lindsay, thanks very much. Well, earlier this afternoon, I spoke to the Security Minister, Ben Wallace, and I began by asking him how the government could be so sure that Russia was to blame.
All the evidence points quite clearly that the Russian state, or indeed, as we gave the Russians a chance 24 hours ago, rogue elements deployed this weapon system. I'm an ex-soldier, Kathy, and chemical weapons are rare. They are not held by most states in the world. It's very quick to focus down on who holds what stocks. And once you get beyond that, science, motive, and historical capability do come into play. And I think it's really sad, actually, that Jeremy Corbyn is actually trying to wriggle out of condemning Russia by taking it out on British intelligence. I just think that's wrong.
Do you think, I mean, he was accused in the Commons today of appeasing Russia. Do you think that's what he's doing?
What I heard in the Commons today was backbencher after backbencher of the Labour Party support the government strategy and the government's process, and I heard Jeremy Corbyn not condemn Russia, not say he supported our unilateral actions of expelling 23 intelligence officers who've been involved in spying in this country, and not actually face up to the reality that a leader of any party has to take, which is we have to keep the public safe and recognise the horrendous crime that was committed last week in Salisbury needs a robust but a considered and proportionate response.
Yeah.
And that's what the government's done.
Is invoking NATO's Article 5 still very much on the table or not?
We've started the process with the Prime Minister talking about going to the UN Security Council, I think, to have a discussion tonight. I think the Security Council is due to discuss the issue. She has also started the process of speaking to European leaders, President Macron for one, and I know she said she's spoken to President Trump in the United States. There are
Do
lots
you
of other
believe
countries.
Article 5 should be invoked?
Well,
Is that still on the table?
I'm not. Look, we're not going to, as a country, rule out anything when it comes to seeking resolution to this attack in Salisbury. And if part of that resolution is internationalising the issue, we will seek to do that. Whether we do that through sanctions or NATO or the United Nations, I think we will work through in the next few days. We're starting at the UN Security Council for a discussion, but everyone knows Russia has a veto as a permanent member. But let's see where this discussion goes.
Given the allegations you've set out against Russia, what does it say about Russia as a country?
I think Russia is squandering its amazing people and its potential because it reads international law as a sort of pick and mix menu. I think that's really sad. Russia is a great country. It's got amazing people, amazing culture. But no, look, this is not Russia per se. This is a problem with the direction of the Russian government over the last few years. It has just become unacceptable to the international community.
Ben Wallace, thank you very much.
Thank you, Cathy.
The British response came today, 10 days after Sergei Skripal, his daughter, and Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey were so badly poisoned by Novichok nerve agent. 23 Russian diplomats are to be expelled. There's a vow to freeze Russian assets that pose a threat here, a suspension of high-level contacts and a downgrading of Britain's attendance at the World Cup. Britain has had some international support this evening. The US ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, said it was the Russians that did it. The French have been mildly more circumspect. But the Russians themselves, they said, is absolutely unacceptable and unworthy of the British to seek to aggravate relations in pursuit of unseemly political ends. At the UN tonight, they demanded material proof of the allegedly found Russian trace. Lots to talk about. Let's hear from Mark Urban first on the approach the British are taking.
So the spy expulsions are on. Nearly 24 regarded as intelligence operatives under diplomatic cover have been told to pack their bags and be out within a week.
This is only one of a number of measures the British government is taking, many of them likely not to be announced publicly, and many of them likely to be what President Eisenhower used to call quiet military measures, that your adversary would see and understand, but that publics wouldn't necessarily see.
Along with the decision to expel 23 Russian diplomats, there'll be more checks on private flights, customs and freight. There'll be asset freezes for Russians who've threatened UK nationals. British officials will boycott the World Cup. High-level contacts, such as a planned visit by the Russian foreign minister, will be suspended, and there'll be new laws against hostile state activity. A long list, but maybe a little short on specifics. And underlying a tentative approach is some tentative language, the government blaming Russia by process of elimination.
They have treated the use of a military-grade nerve agent in Europe with sarcasm, contempt and defiance. So, Mr. Speaker, there is no alternative conclusion other than that the Russian state was culpable for the attempted murder of Mr. Skripal and his daughter.
And even in its letter yesterday to the International Chemical Weapons Body, the OPCW, the UK has said of the Novichok agents, Russia has previously produced this agent and would still be capable of doing so. It does not say that the origin of the Salisbury Novichok can be proven.
I think the dilemma probably is that there's very, very strong circumstantial evidence. The Russians were given the chance to respond and reacted dismissively, but there is no suspect, and therefore there isn't a criminal level of proof yet. But the government has been under great pressure to come forward with an initial set of measures. They've now done that, and this is the first stage of what will, I guess, develop now into a more general discussion at the Security Council, in NATO, in the EU, about what's behind it and how countries should now regard Russia in terms of, are they a responsible and serious member of the international community?
So the government's not yet been able to tie Russian-made Novichok by its molecular fingerprint to the Salisbury poisoning. Not publicly anyway. Its decision to involve the OPCW watchdog in analysing samples from the incident will take the crisis onto an international plane.
I think that's both a confidence-building measure and also plays to one of our great strengths in the West, right? Our great contrasting strengths to the Russians are transparency, allies, and international institutions.
Russians on the panel? Would you?
I wouldn't want that. Well, that would be the OPCW's choice. My sense is that the Russians ought to be able to be present to see what's happening, but that actually neither the Russians nor the British should be on the panel.
The government's tentative language may reflect that they still haven't identified the precise origin of the nerve agent, and they don't seem to have any suspects in planting it. But it may also be part of a strategy to leave some ambiguity to let the Russians find an off-ramp. In the coming days, though, the language is likely to firm up.
Today's spy expulsion could be the start of a long path of crisis, move and counter-move, and all the while, the lives of two desperately ill people in Salisbury hang in the balance.
Mark Urban there. Well, earlier today, I spoke to the Security Minister, Ben Wallace. I asked him whether the measures the government had announced were just about it.
We've taken a step today that we think is proportionate and sends a message to the Russians that this is not acceptable and that things need to change, but also that downgrades operationally their ability of intelligence officers in London to prosecute espionage against us, both economically and in the security space. And at the same time, we've talked about progressing this through starting the process of internationalising the response, and that's why the Prime Minister talked about a UN discussion at the UN Security Council, and she has spoken to world leaders such as Donald Trump and President Macron as well.
I mean, one of the areas that has been much talked about are financial measures to sanction probably named individuals who we suspect are Putin cronies and friends and have assets, significant assets in London. Should we be embarrassed, really, that there are these people in London, that we have allowed ourselves to get into the position where bad people have felt London is a place, a comfortable place, to park money and do business?
I think we all collectively in the body politics have to take responsibility for that. That, we have allowed the City of London's reputation as a centre for world finance to be exploited by some pretty nasty individuals who have used illicit money flows from around the world to come here, either to harbour it or to clean it or to just move it around or invest it.
Let's be clear. If you are a foreign oligarch or kleptocrat bringing money to London, the party is over. That London industry is now going to close.
That is what we want the message to be, and we are going to do steps to take the money off you if we can't get you as well. And only last week, Evan, Britain went up in the rankings of least corrupt countries. We are now 8th in the world. I'd like to see that go higher.
It does say, by the way, the Chemical Weapons Convention, it does back up one Russian point on all of this. It's Article 9, Paragraph 2, for all it matters, that where a complaint is made, the country against whom it's made has 10 days to respond. Should we have given them the 10 days? Should we have stuck to the form of the letter of the law, just so no one can mock us or laugh at us on the basis that we haven't...
I think we've already gone a long way. We took our time and we have done a thorough job, and that is, and the reason for that is, you know, consequences flow from it. And I wanted the public to realise that we're not cooking this up, it's not some dodgy dossier, this is a genuine appraisal of the facts, the motives, the responses of Russia, and have taken the view that we are certain the evidence points to Russia deploying this. You know, you say we could have given them 10 days. I think within minutes out of the trap, they said, we're not responding to British demands. So I think once they said that, I think, you know, it's pretty certain that we can be in a space that Russia's denials, which, you know, pretty legendary in Litvinenko, are going to remain, and we are not going to tolerate it. And you know, removing 23 intelligence officers from London is, you know, I think actually some of the public will be wondering why we didn't remove them before.
Why didn't we do it before, given that everything we've known about Russia and Crimea and Litvinenko and other assassinations and all sorts of things?
I think because when you decide to assert yourself, there's a cost for that. There could be reprisals. So we you know, could we contain the threat they were posing and all that? Well, would have been an operational decision at the time.
The Allies have given some encouragement, haven't they? The French, the Germans, even President Trump has given some encouragement. We're on your side, Britain, we hear what's happened. Do you fear that that's as far as they're going to go?
No, I don't. You know, this is the time that a government earns its money. You know, ministers will be out talking to ambassadors, you know, leaders will be ringing leaders, and we will be developing and helping design a response that deters Russia and also downgrades their operational ability. You know, let's remember, Russia doesn't just spy on Britain, it spies on lots of our friends and allies. It prosecutes cybercrime against our allies. We've already named a number of, helped identify and name a number of cyber attacks by Russia on European allies and other countries. So we you know, they're not stupid, they know what's going on. And I think I'm optimistic we are going to get a good response.
Security Minister Ben Wallace there. Of course, it is all about building an international coalition, isn't it? Here with me to discuss that is that whole international reaction is Nina Schick. She's from the Rasmussen Global think tank. Joins us from Brussels. A very good interview. A very good evening to you. Nina, you heard what the Security Minister said there. He's optimistic. There will be more than rhetoric in support of the UK. Is that your expectation, particularly from the Europeans?
The first thing to point out, Evan, is that this attack on the UK is actually an attack on all Western liberal democracies. I work at Rasmussen, and our CEO is Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the former Secretary General of NATO. So we believe that there has to be a strong Western response to this, because this is just the latest in Russia's hybrid war against the West. Now, Theresa May has done all she can do domestically, but of course, in order to send the Kremlin a really tough message, she needs to get an alliance behind her. And this is really where realpolitik and Brexit collide. Ironically, Theresa May has more recourse, paradoxically, via the EU right now than perhaps even via the US or NATO. And I think what she can hope for is that she will be raising it at the European Council Summit on Friday, and what she can hope for, and she has the grounding in international law, to ask the EU to extend its sanctions, which already are in place since 2014, since the invasion of Ukraine, on Russia. Now, that will be difficult because some members of the EU are already dragging their feet on that, but because of the nature of this attack, and it is a very serious one, I think she will have a lot of sympathetic leaders listening to her in the EU, and we already saw a very strong response from many European leaders, far stronger than...
It's interesting you say that, because the French they were slightly circumspect. They said they want firm proof. And last time, after Litvinenko, the British ambassador to Moscow at the time said he was talking to Europeans, the EU leaders at that time, about trying to get support. This is Tony Brenton. He said they were, I'm paraphrasing, pretty hopeless. They just really weren't anywhere to be seen.
Absolutely. It's not going to be easy, and this matter is going to be further complicated by the fact that the UK is obviously on its way out of the EU. Nonetheless, the UK will have allies, not to mention the Baltic states and the Central and Eastern European states, who will be very sympathetic to the UK's position because of their own historical experience with Russia's, shall we say, particularly boisterous brand of nationalism. I think the best we can hope for is an extension of those sanctions, which are due to be extended in June for a period of 12 months rather than 6. But still, that is doing something that is the most effective body of sanctions on Russia right now. Again, long term, in order to address this question of Russian meddling in the Western Transatlantic Alliance, there has to be a more robust and concerted effort across the transatlantic with the US and with the EU and with Britain. And that's something that we're working on right now. But the UK faces a very difficult challenge because its two kind of traditional pillars of foreign security, one being Europe and the other being the US, are tenuous at the moment.
Nina Schick, thank you very much indeed. Well, now, after the Prime Minister's statement today, Jeremy Corbyn gave a response, and it's turned into quite a big issue. Many, including Labour MPs, felt it was far too easy on the Russians and too harsh, if anything, on the UK. Here's a clip from it.
The attack in Salisbury was an appalling act of violence. How has she responded to the Russian government's request for a sample of the agent used in the Salisbury attack to run its own tests? Has high-resolution trace analysis been run on a sample of the nerve agent, and has that revealed any evidence as to the location of its production or the identity of its perpetrators?
Well, then there was a subsequent press briefing in defence of Jeremy Corbyn by his spokesman, Seamus Milne, and that seemed to compound things. He's reported to have said there's a history between WMDs and intelligence which is problematic, to put it mildly, drawing obvious comparison to the flawed intelligence in the run-up to the Iraq War. Well, I'm joined by Nick Thomas-Symonds, Labour's Shadow Security Minister. Very good evening to you.
Good evening, Evan.
Do you think there's any comparison to be drawn between the flawed intelligence in the run-up to Iraq and what we have here?
No, and I don't think it's about flawed intelligence. We have great confidence in the work that the security services do. It's a distinction, obviously, between the interpretation that politicians can make of intelligence and intelligence itself.
But this isn't an intelligence case, is it? This is a forensic laboratory result that says we found a chemical weapon.
Yes.
One that the world knows is one that was developed in the Soviet Union and the Russians have.
Yes.
So it's not. It was a stupid comparison. I mean, are you going to accept that?
Well, I'm not going to accept that interpretation, and I think we really need to shift as well from what may or may not have been said to what is actually the position here. There's been a very serious incident that's happened on British soil, Evan. The evidence absolutely points towards Russia, and it's the two possible explanations that the Prime Minister gave, either that Russia was primarily and deliberately responsible, or it's negligently responsible in the sense that it's lost control of its nerve agent. Now, that's the way that the evidence is pointing, and given the way the evidence is, and given the response, or failure to respond, we've had from the Russians this week, the measures the Prime Minister has proposed are proportionate in the circumstances.
Okay, I was trying to get you to be harsh on Seamus Milne. You don't want to do that. Do you agree, at least, his briefing was a distraction from the message that the Labour Party is trying to put out today?
No, I mean, Evan, really, in terms of the relationship between what spokespeople say and what the press say, and whether things are taken out of context or not...
Well, I don't think it was taken out of context. I've got your transcript of it. The PA transcript is slightly different, but they both have the comparison to WMD. It just seems very strange. There was no WMD. There obviously is a toxic poison.
Well, no, there is obviously an issue as to how politicians interpret intelligence, of course, but the point that I'm trying to make, Evan, is we have a very serious situation here, and I'm simply pointing out that in these circumstances we are looking at the evidence, backing the work that's been done on the ground, whether it's the Army, the Security Service, the police. We have a police officer, Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey, who is, of course, ill. We're thinking of him. We're thinking of Mr Skripal, his daughter, and others who've been affected by this, and we utterly condemn the actions of taken place.
And in terms of what you think, who you think did it, the Russians, essentially, is your most likely culprit.
The evidence is certainly pointing in that direction. All I would say is this, Evan, and we see this from the point that has been made by the spokesperson for the French government in recent days. We want to build the widest possible international coalition to be able to tackle this issue and to seek to ensure, as Jeremy Corbyn said very clearly in the Commons today, that we do not want this kind of incident happening on British soil again. To do that, the better the standard of proof we can have, that is surely better in building an international coalition.
Can I ask, because Jeremy Corbyn didn't condemn the Russians for the chemical weapon, use of a chemical weapon on British soil today, and I'm interested in, did he not condemn them because he thought it was too soon to condemn them, or because he doesn't think it's them, or just because he had lots of other things to say?
Well, firstly, I don't accept that interpretation of Jeremy's speech. When I was sat there on the Commons benches and I heard it, he actually quoted the Prime Minister verbatim on the two explanations, and then afterwards made clear that we should have a decisive, proportionate response based on the evidence.
And I don't think anyone would argue with that. No one's going to argue with it.
And that's an absolutely reasonable position for the Leader of the Opposition to take.
But in a funny sort of way, in order to have the licence to make all those points, the public, or a lot of the public, will say, I want to know that you absolutely feel the same kind of outrage over this happening on our soil that a lot of other people think. And he didn't sort of express that outrage. He said we have to speak out against the abuse of human rights by the Putin government and their supporters. But he didn't seem to show the anger at what we think the Russians have done in Salisbury. And I wonder whether, in retrospect, maybe that was just a sort of the wrong way to go.
I don't accept that. And, of course, what's said is a matter for interpretation for the listener. At the start of the speech, he made absolutely clear his abhorrence at the use of a nerve agent like this on a civilian population in the way that it has been. That was said at the outset of the speech. Towards the end of the speech, he also set out our absolute abhorrence for Russia's human rights record, which we unequivocally condemn.
Nick Thomas-Symonds, thanks so much. Thanks.
Thank you.